Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit, I'll try to keep this shorter, talking about possible drivers of income discrimination across different groups of people in society. And this being a really important topic, even though it maybe is not directly related to natural resource management directly, it's a really important underlying issue across almost all sectors of the economy, and so it's really important to understand how it might be driving inequitable outcomes. So firstly, just to return to kind of where we were at the very beginning, we talked about why we might expect discrimination to be driven out of a perfectly competitive market, because as long as there are profits to be made, people will take advantage if someone isn't being hired because of their race. And if it's possible to get some amount of profit out of them, some non-discriminating firm will come in and be willing to hire them because we have free entry, and we're assuming we have some distribution of firms or employers of different levels of discrimination. So even if there's just a tiniest chance that there's some firm that's not discriminating, they will enter the market and take advantage of that profit-making opportunity. So then obviously we don't have that. We repeatedly see disparities in income, wages, wealth, and employment levels across different genders, across different groups, across different racial and ethnic groups in society, and not just in the United States. So what exactly is explaining those disparities? And we'll talk about some possible mechanisms for why we see this, just like what were the mechanisms that were driving the discrepancies in amount of pollution faced by different groups. So again, we kind of start with maybe what you think of immediately, the pure, or another way to say this is taste-based discrimination, which is that firms or employers are not optimizing just over profits, but over some racial preference. They gain something from hiring a white person over a non-white person, or paying that white person, and that allows them to pay that white person a little bit extra. Again, this is something that most economists, I would imagine, are skeptical that this is the mechanism that's driving things. I think there's a lot of effort in the economics literature, for better or worse, to argue that firms are actually accurately sorting people they're setting wages according to people's educational background, their work experience, their amount of productivity that they think they can get out of that person. And at first that might sound reasonable, might sound like, well, if people are accurately sorting, then where's the discrimination? The problem is that then if the discrimination is entering in a different part of the system, if people of different backgrounds, different racial groups, different ethnic groups have different access to education, different access to different types of work experience, then they are going to be accurately sorted out repeatedly of the market. And that's kind of this vicious cycle of creating different economic pathways for different people in society that are reinforced by this accurate sorting. So it's important, if you see people in economics trying to limit the argument to this accurate sorting, that's why in these discussions, I'm trying to always have us zoom out and say, we got to look at the whole system to understand what's going on here. Another possible mechanism that has been put forth in economics is called statistical discrimination. This is a very common theory that's discussed in economics, and it's this setting where employers may lack information or lack the ability to perfectly observe all the information they would like about an individual when they're trying to decide whether to hire them or how much to pay them. And because they can't perfectly observe all that information, they will use information about the groups that that person belongs to, whether it's their gender, their age, their race, and using the group averages, extrapolate that information and apply it to that individual. So again, this is occasionally, statistical discrimination is sometimes compared to pure or taste-based discrimination as kind of less insidious. It's just people making rational choices based on a lack of perfect information, but at least the best information that they have available to them. You might hear, hopefully you listened to the Marketplace spot that features William Spriggs, who's an economist at Howard University. He has some really interesting things to say about statistical discrimination and how it's described in economics being a microaggression and kind of an insidious justification for ongoing discrimination, because we're kind of softening it as this, people are just making an observation. They don't have any inherent racial animus, even though the statistics that people believe that they have may still be motivated by racial animus, and it's very difficult to dissect. Okay, what exact statistics are being drawn upon to form these perceptions of individuals. So it's important, I think, to recognize that there's a lot inherent in statistical discrimination, and it's worth digging deeper into what is what exactly do we mean when we say statistical discrimination. And I think just two ways that statistical discrimination can manifest in more insidious ways is that if individuals know that they're only going to be judged by their group average, it's very difficult to justify investment in your own human capital, like investing more in education, investing more in, whatever it is, internships, unpaid internships, which are so important in a lot of sectors now. If they know it's very difficult for those things to pay off for them, then they may not invest in them. And so we have this suboptimal level of human capital investment in groups that are being judged by their group averages, because each individual does not recognize the positive externalities of their own personal investments by raising your group average. You may not directly experience that, the positive benefits of raising your group average. So anyway, statistical discrimination is not like the preferred form of discrimination, is kind of, I think, the main takeaway here. There is some interesting discussion about how unintended consequences that are driven by statistical discrimination can manifest in policies. So there's a really interesting example of this ban the box policy effort, where different advocacy groups have worked to eliminate the presence of a box on employment forms where you would need to indicate whether you've ever been convicted of a crime or been in prison, because having to put that information on an employment form can create stigma and make it more difficult for people to re-enter society and get their life back on track. And so there's this effort to ban the box to try to remove that stigma. But some research has shown that rather than addressing the problem, it actually forces employers instead choose to use other information to try to gauge whether someone may or may not have been a convict or convicted of a crime, because they don't have perfect information about this. They'll just use information about someone's age and race and gender. Younger Black men predominantly are the ones who are more likely to be convicted. Again, a whole other set of structural issues to interrogate there. But if you're removing the information, then employers will turn to the statistical discrimination instead. And so you can have impacts on even more people, negative impacts on employment for even more people than you did before. And so people have suggested, okay, instead of removing this information, instead you could do things like give firms tax incentives to hire ex-convicts, or you could another thing that people have suggested is give kind of court-endorsed rehabilitation information or endorsements to say, okay, this person, the court has complete faith that this person is rehabilitated, and you should trust them. And so that kind of removes some of the risk for the company or the firm looking to hire this person. They can say, okay, well, this court vouches for this person, so I feel good. So there's this response to, instead of removing information, give more information and provide the incentives that people need to try to correct this social inequity. Okay, and then the last two potential mechanisms, I would say these mechanisms are not well incorporated in the economics literature, but are well recognized in sociology. And I know this because a couple of sociologists wrote a really good paper. Small and Pager last year wrote a good paper, kind of what do economists need to do to better recognize some of these issues in our research. And two things that they talked about that economics does not do a good job is recognizing the role of implicit bias. And so that's this concept of discrimination, people harboring discrimination that they don't even consciously recognize, that it's so learned and internal that we're not weighing it against the cost of exercising that discrimination. So we're it's a twist on this pure discrimination because, sociologists have the flexibility to not have to argue that people are rational. We're actually making choices that we're not optimizing against. And that's something that we could learn a little bit of that flexibility from them. And then also this concept of institutional discrimination, where no single individual is directly perpetuating the discrimination, but it's actually just codified into the norms of an organization or even codified into law. And so one example of this is hiring norms. If firms are encouraging people already employed to try to find someone to fill a certain position, and if most people in that firm are already white, because people tend to have friends that are of their own race, then the person to fill that position is most likely going to be white. And okay, so where does the discrimination enter there? It's maybe how people form friendships, but maybe that's part of where people live, and everything else about our society, about who we end up interacting with. So even any one of these mechanisms can be tied to other mechanisms in society. And that's what makes it so difficult to try to kind of nail down what exactly is driving this problem. And it makes it really difficult to, it does make it difficult for economics to try to address this problem, because we're so interested in trying to identify these very specific causal effects in a system. So there's work to be done. Economics may not be perfectly equipped to address all of these questions, but it's definitely equipped to try to tackle some of these questions, and we should try to do it. And so there's a really nice paper by Jennifer Doliak from last year where she's taking on some of the kind of the history of economic literature in discrimination, and kind of cautioning against only using economic theory to kind of dissuade people from trying to engage policy or trying to use government intervention to address discrimination. She's saying, we can utilize our knowledge about market forces and about individual incentives to try to make the world a better place. And, I personally think that economics can and should play a role in that, and that we need a lot more people to come into the economics field to think about those things as well. So great. I hope this has been somewhat useful, and love to talk to you guys about this in office hours.